A Dog's Life, The Autobiography of a Stray, by Anne M. Martin, published by Scholastic Press. Companions. I slept soundly that first night at Susan's on my bed by the radiator. I woke up several times, uncertain where I was, but when I looked around and saw the kitchen, saw the water bowl by my bed, smelled the smells of Susan's house, I remembered the events of the day, and I fell asleep again. Early the next morning, before the sun was up, I heard Susan's voice as she made her way down the stairs. "Addie! Good morning, Addie!" she called softly. She shuffled into the kitchen wearing a long robe, scuffy slippers on her feet. I lifted my head. Then I sat up. "Ah, I see you're feeling better. That's fine," said Susan. She bent to stroke me. She ran her hand down my back, then reached under my chin. "Every dog should start her day with a chin scratch," she announced. She moved her hand to the top of my head. "May I pat you here?" she asked. "On your head? Not all dogs like that, I know." I sat very still. Then I closed my eyes. "Squinty eyes!" exclaimed Susan. "A wonderful sign." She picked up my water bowl and emptied it into the sink, then refilled it. Now what shall we have for breakfast today?" she said a moment later as she peered into the refrigerator. "I think perhaps I'll have scrambled eggs, and you can have the hamburger and rice that's left over from the other night." And that is just what we did have, except that Susan also gave me some of her scrambled eggs. It was the first time I had ever eaten them warm right out of a frying pan. Warm scrambled eggs were awfully good. "All right," said Susan when we had finished our breakfast. "I hope you're ready for your big day, Addie." Our big day didn't start right away. First, Susan went upstairs for a long time. When she returned, she was wearing different clothes, and she smelled different. "All gussied up," she said to me. "I'm 82 years old, and I can gussy up with the best of them. There's not a thing about me that's old, except my bones." Susan clipped the leash to me then and walked me around outside again until I relieved myself. "Good girl!" she exclaimed, and handed me a cookie. After that it was time to get into the car. Susan carried my nest of blankets from the kitchen into the garage. "Come on, Addie," she called, and I followed her even though I was not clipped to the leash. Susan opened the front door of her car. "Now my Maxie liked to sit up front, in the front seat, right next to me," she said. She turned and regarded me. "I don't know if you've ever ridden in a car before. I hope you won't be scared. Maxie loved it. You can look out the window. Sometimes you can see cats or squirrels or other dogs. It can really be very entertaining. Maxie used to sit up tall and stare straight ahead. I called him my co-pilot." Susan had arranged the blankets on the seat of the car. She looked down at me. "Are you ready, Addie? This is your big adventure." I sat by the car and looked back at Susan. Susan patted the seat. "Jump on up here, Addie." I scrambled onto the blanket. "Good girl," said Susan, sounding relieved. She walked around to the other side of the car and eased herself behind the steering wheel. Soon we were driving down the lane. I watched the country fly by outside the window. At first it looked familiar. I smelled familiar smells, too. I saw snow, lots of snow, some trees, and here and there a house. Eventually the houses appeared closer together, and the smells became unfamiliar. Then we reached the edge of a town that was bigger than Claremont, but that reminded me of it anyway, and I sat up taller. Susan glanced at me. "This is the nearest town, Addie," she said as she parked the car on the street. "It's called Hampton. This is where I do all my shopping and errands. Are you ready for our errands? I really do have quite a few. Our first stop is the dry cleaner. Now you sit here, and I'll be right back. If you get bored, you can chew on this." Susan handed me an enormous object that looked like a bone but didn't smell like any bone I'd ever found in the woods. I licked it, then I placed it between my front paws and set to work chewing on it. Susan left me alone for a few minutes. When she returned, she was carrying an armload of things in flapping plastic bags, which she put in the back of the car. We set off again. "Next stop, the post office," said Susan. "Goodness, it's nice to have a companion along. How's that bone, Addie?" I chomped away. I wasn't even looking out the window any more. Susan drove to the post office next, where she went inside with a small package and came out with a stack of envelopes. Then she took us to a place called a bank, to a place called a pharmacy, and finally to a bakery. After the bakery, when we were sitting in the car that now smelled of butter and sugar and bread, Susan said, "Well, Addie, the next stop is going to be your big treat today. I suppose I should really give you the treat after we go to the vet as a reward, but I'd have to drive us way out of the way in order to do that. So you'll get the treat first." Listen to me talking in Blue Streak. I haven't spoken so much in months. But this is silly. I'm going on and on as if you could understand every word I'm saying. Susan rested her arms on the steering wheel and looked thoughtful. "Well, maybe you can," she went on. "Who knows? Anyway, off to Pet Town." Susan pulled out of the bakery parking lot and drove us back through Hampton. A few minutes later she said, "Here we are. This is Pet Town, Addie. It's a brand new store. You can buy anything you need for your pet here, and people are allowed to bring their pets inside. So come on in with me and we'll find what you need." Susan clipped the leash to my collar and we walked inside a huge building. When we stepped through the doors, my nose was met with so many smells that I raised my head sniffing and then stood on my hind legs to get the best smells possible. Susan laughed. "There's a lot of good stuff in here, isn't there?" I had never experienced anything like it. I had sniffed around the Wagging Tail in Claremont and other pet stores, but I had never been inside one. Now I saw shelf after shelf of things, many of which were unfamiliar to me, but that smelled very, very interesting. Later, after I had been to Pet Town several more times, I learned what these things were: supplies for cats and other animals, which Susan and I ignored, dog food, in cans and in bags, dog toys, dog beds, dog chews, and dog clothes. The clothes looked like the outfits I had seen children wearing at Halloween, and I was relieved when Susan said she thought a dog in clothes was silly and we could walk right by them. "Now, let's see," said Susan. "You'll need a proper bed, not those old blankets. They'll be all right for the car, but not for your bed. And we have to get some food. I know eggs and hamburger and scraps are tasty, but you need a balanced diet. Here's the food Maxie used to eat. Oh, I must remember to ask Skip about vitamins." Susan turned a corner and we walked down another aisle. "My, look at all these toys, Addie." Susan had found a shopping cart and she pushed it along, filling it with things she took from the shelves. She consulted a list that she pulled out of her purse. Bed, check. Food, check. Stuffed toy, check. Chewies, check. Throw toys. I don't know if you'll be up for chasing toys. Maybe I'll just buy one. When Susan was finished shopping, she had bought so many things that someone had to help her carry them to the car. "And now," she said as we drove away, "it's off to the vet." She looked at her watch. "We'll be right on time." The moment Susan led me inside Dr. Thompson's office, I recalled the smells from my stay at Dr. Roth's, and I remembered my visit there. I remembered Moon lying so still beside me, and I also remembered Dr. Roth's gentle hands and Rachel, and I didn't feel nervous as we settled ourselves in the waiting room. I sat at Susan's feet, and from time to time I glanced over my shoulder at her. When I did, she would smile and pat my back and tell me I was a good girl. The waiting room was warm, and I was tired, so I was beginning to fall asleep when a young woman stepped into the room and said, "Mrs. McGrath?" "Yes," said Susan, and she stood up. "Sorry to wake you, Addie, but it's our turn." In the little examining room I was lifted onto a metal table, where I sat until a man came in carrying a clipboard and said, "Susan, it's wonderful to see you again. Who do we have here?" "Hi, Skip," said Susan. "This dog has been hanging round my house for a long time, and yesterday I finally persuaded her to come inside. She's lovely, but I don't know anything about her. I thought I'd better have her checked out." Dr. Thompson began examining me. He was very gentle, like Dr. Roth. He looked in my mouth, he ran his hands down my back and over my belly, he listened to my heart, and he looked carefully at my paws. "Well," he said after a long time, "this dog isn't in bad shape, considering she's a stray. Are you sure she's a stray?" "Positive," replied Susan, "because she's been spayed. I can see the old scar on her belly. She must have been someone's dog once." "I'll bet she has a lot of stories to tell," said Susan. Dr. Thompson looked down at me. "She seems a bit weak and dehydrated, and she's on the thin side. I see evidence of ear mites and fleas, not out of control, though, and I notice that her feet have been bleeding. I think she has some cracks in her pads. I should probably check for worms and parasites. Her vital signs are good." Dr. Thompson paused. "I'd say this dog is 9 or 10 years old." 9 or 10, repeated Susan. "In dog years, that's almost 60. She'll need shots, too, of course," Dr. Thompson went on. "And she could stand a good bath. Do you want us to go ahead and do everything, give her injections and get the medicine for the mites and so forth?" "Absolutely." "It won't be cheap." "I know." "Does that mean you want to keep her?" "Want to keep her? Why, she's mine already," said Susan. That night I fell asleep by the radiator in my bed, a teddy bear at my side. Two old ladies. The winter days at Susan's passed slowly and gently, like leaves falling from trees. Every morning I awoke in the kitchen in my bed by the radiator. I always woke before Susan came downstairs, and I would roll over and lie on my teddy until I heard Susan's footsteps. When Susan entered the kitchen, she would greet me with pats and kisses and chin scratches, and then she would make our breakfast. Dog food for me, and toast and eggs and fruit for her. She always gave me a bite of warm eggs, though. In the mornings I kept Susan company while she was busy at her desk or with her sewing or puttering around the house. Sometimes she talked on the telephone. Sometimes one of her friends would drop by and Susan would fix tea. Susan made sure to walk me around outside the house every so often, and each time I relieved myself outdoors, she gave me a cookie. During the first few days I was at Susan's, I relieved myself indoors a couple of times, and Susan would show me those spots and say, "No cookie, Addie." Then she would clean the spots with something in a white bottle, and eventually understood that I was not to relieve myself indoors. I also understood that Susan would make sure I went outdoors often enough so that I wasn't uncomfortable. At lunchtime, Susan ate a small meal in the kitchen. I did not get a meal at lunch anymore, although Susan usually gave me a bite of hers. In the afternoon, Susan and I would climb in the car and run errands together. My favorite places to visit were Pet Town and the bakery. Susan always brought me into Pet Town with her, and sometimes someone in there would give me a treat. In the evening, Susan and I ate dinner in the kitchen. Afterwards, Susan usually worked at her sewing or read a book. We would sit together on the couch. If possible, I would rest my head in Susan's lap. I had been living at Susan's for a while. I wasn't sure exactly how long, because I was less aware of the shape of the moon than I had been when I lived outside. When the doorbell rang one morning and Susan exclaimed, "Goodness, now who could that be? I'm not expecting anybody." Susan had been sorting through some cartons that she had brought into the living room from another part of the house. She left them on the floor and called, "Who is it?" as she hurried to the front door. "It's Mrs. Oliver," I heard someone reply. I watched Susan. She stopped walking, stood very still in the hallway, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and muttered, "Oh, drat." Then she opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Oliver," said Susan. "Hello, dear." A stout woman stepped into the hallway, tracking snow in after her. "Would you like to take off your boots?" Susan asked, looking at the wet marks on the carpet. Oh, yes, of course. It's still so chilly out there," said Mrs. Oliver as she stooped down to slip off her boots. "I don't know how you're managing out here all by yourself in this cold." Susan looked perplexed. "I have a furnace," she said. Mrs. Oliver's face colored. "I meant with the shoveling and driving and all." "Mac is still coming by to shovel me out, just like always," said Susan, "and they do seem to plow the road so quickly nowadays, I never have to wait long before I can get out." Mrs. Oliver had removed her coat. She hung it in the closet in the hall. Then she stepped into the living room. "Why, Susan, I see you're getting ready for Christmas. That's lovely. How did you get all these boxes in here?" "I carried them," said Susan. "I can still—" "My heavens, what on earth is that?" Mrs. Oliver interrupted her. She was pointing at me. "It's a dog." "Well, I know it's a dog, dear. I meant, what is it doing here?" "Her name is Addie, and this is her home." "Oh, Susan!" Mrs. Oliver looked deeply disappointed, as if Susan had chewed up a couch cushion. "Now, how are you going to manage a dog? Where did she come from, anyway?" "She'd been hanging around the house. She was nearly frozen to death, but I've been taking her to skip, and she has a clean bill of health." Mrs. Oliver didn't seem to be listening. She had bent down and was running her hand through the carpet. "What—" Susan began to say. I'm just checking for flea dirt. Flea dirt? Tst. Susan looked disgusted. Addie does not have fleas. She paused. She does not have ear mites either, or the mane. She's in perfect health. She's just old. And so are you, replied Mrs. Oliver, standing up. Really, my dear, how are you going to take care of this dog? She's too large for you to pick up, and she's decrepit. Is she even housebroken? Of course she's housebroken. Mrs. Oliver sniffed. Well, I'll admit that the house smells fine. Susan stared at her. After a moment, Mrs. Oliver turned away from Susan and approached me. I was curled up on the couch. She seems a nice enough dog, Mrs. Oliver said finally. But really, Susan, have you thought this through? An old dog is only going to get harder to care for. What are you going to do if she can't walk, or if she becomes incontinent? If you ask me, you should take her to the shelter. Let them find a home for her with younger people. Susan drew herself up straight. Mrs. Oliver, she began, Addie is good company. I'm sure that's true. And furthermore, Susan hesitated, furthermore, oh my, it's starting to snow. You should probably be on your way before the roads get too slippery. Mrs. Oliver glanced outside. All right, but dear, I suggest you think about what I said. Susan planted herself in front of Mrs. Oliver and said firmly, I will do no such thing. Addie is here to stay. Then she crossed through the hallway and held the door open, while Mrs. Oliver slipped into her coat and boots again and stepped onto the porch. Have a good, Mrs. Oliver said, but Susan had already closed the door. She turned to look at me. Hateful woman, she exclaimed, and I thought she said it rather loudly. She returned to the living room and sat next to me on the couch. Did you understand any of that, Addie? She asked, stroking my muzzle. I hope not, but if you did, I just want to assure you that I have no intention of taking you to a shelter. You're mine, and I'm yours, and this is our home. That night Susan put me to bed in the kitchen as usual, and for a while I lay by the radiator and gazed outside. The moon must have been full because Susan's yard was lit up, and I could see the new snow coating the tree branches. Suddenly, without knowing I was going to do so, I stood stiffly and walked to the bottom of the staircase. I looked up. The second story seemed far away, and I wasn't used to stairs, although I had climbed Susan's once or twice. I let out a sigh before I began to make my way up the steps. I knew where Susan's bedroom was, and when I reached it, I nosed through the partially open door, then stood on my hind legs and peered into the bed. Susan stirred, but she didn't seem surprised to see me. Hello, old lady, she said. What are you doing up here? You should be in your own bed. I stared at Susan for a few more seconds, then dropped to all fours and attempted to jump onto the bed. It was very high, though, and I slipped back to the floor. Oh, dear, said Susan. She was as stiff as I was, and she moved slowly. She pushed back the covers, hung her legs over the side of the bed, and finally stood beside me. Come on back downstairs. I didn't move. Susan smiled. Oh, all right, she said. She shoved a footstool next to me. Here, use this. She coaxed me onto the stool and placed my front paws on the bed. I jumped, and Susan shoved my rump up, and the next thing I knew I was crawling under the covers, and Susan was climbing in beside me. We slept together all night, and that is how we have spent every night since then. Home. It is another summer. Susan and I have lived together now for many changes of the moon. Every morning and evening we eat in the kitchen. At night we sleep in Susan's bed. During the day we keep each other company, and now that the warm weather is here, we take short walks near Susan's house. Recently Susan whispered to me, Remember when I said the last thing I needed was a dog? Well, that wasn't true, of course. I do need you, and I'm glad you're here. We're sitting side by side on the couch when she says this, and I slide into Susan's lap and heave a huge sigh. Many years ago I thought my life would be whole if I could just find Bone again, but I didn't find him, and Mother was gone, and Moon was gone, and I had decided I was complete on my own. Then I found Susan. I didn't think I needed a human, any more than Susan thought she needed a dog. It turned out that there was room in my heart for a human after all. The long ago days, the days of Mother and Bone in the shed, have become fuzzy and have blended with images of Moon, of my travels, of other people and houses, of hiding places, a tangle of memories leading to Susan. I burrow into her side and listen to her heartbeat. With my eyes closed, I might be in the straw-filled wheelbarrow again, nestling against Mother, listening to the first heartbeat I knew. I open my eyes and tilt my head back to look at Susan's lined face. She smiles at me, and we sit pressed into each other, two old ladies. The end.